Cool. I'm good. Uh, Feeling a little removed already. Feel like a couple classes of doing this remotely, and I forget where I am sometimes. I'm in the building. I'm in Upham Hall, and there's like two people here. Very quiet out in the world. So yeah, I know you're out there. It's just hard to feel like everybody's here sometimes. So hope everybody's holding up okay. Switch gears and think about holidays pretty soon. All right. So we're gonna finish up. We're a little bit behind, kind of staggering our wrap up one topic and start the next one. So we got through a lot of the hormones content. Um, I'm a little bit. I don't feel the hormones concept fits into nice, neat boxes because it is kind of particular depending on the cells and the locations. Um, so I guess I want to give you some familiarity with the kinds of effects that hormones can give. And then some of the more commonly known reasons or effects of certain hormones. So we have plants basically signaling to themselves to respond to something, some kind of external condition or developmental state. And then there are the applications that people can use hormones for, depending on location and desired outcome. So we got anything from seedless fruits to herbicides to rooting your stems, tissue culture. So lots of applications. So we kind of got through auxin and cytokinin, which are a little bit at different ends of the plant, producing different signals. So cytokinin's more involved in the root part of the plant. Auxin's more involved in the shoot tips and encouraging the respective parts of the plant to grow. Kind of a nice, I don't know, if you want to simplify these down, kind of a nice way to think about them, different ends of the plant. And then we got up to gibberellins. This is one that this gibberellic acid we actually tried using to germinate seeds and is often a common signal for causing seeds to germinate. And it's an interesting one because gibberellins are, they got their name from a fungus called, down here at the bottom of the screen, Gibberella. And this is a fungus that infects rice, and so it was known originally as this problematic infection, and uh, the infection causes some interesting growth effects on the plant. So um, sometimes other organisms will tap into hormone signaling and kind of hijack the normal signaling in a plant, and so that's kind of what's being done here. Causes the growth to go a little bit haywire, produces an interesting disease phenotype of extra growth, a little bit of cell death around this area. So I guess really we covered that in the context of seed germination. I guess that's how I know gibberellins most of all. Back at the beginning of this topic, we had an example of gibberellins. So this is another effect of gibberellins are known to do. So you can artificially increase the size of your grapes by applying gibberellin hormone. But I don't have too much on that. So moving ahead to different kind, abscisates. So the most common, or maybe original one here is called abscisic acid. And kind of an interesting story on the name for this one. Abscisates got named because they were thought to be involved in the process of abscission. Have we talked about that before? So this is related to the word scissors. And it's basically organs, basically a process of cutting away. I'm going to write more slowly here. So in a couple slides, I've got one that shows the process of abscission. So probably the most familiar one of these is when leaves fall off of a plant, right? So when leaves fall in the autumn, they were connected to the plant. They had vascular tissue connecting them, water in, sugar out. That's okay, Renee. I know what you were going for. Right. So leaves falling off of the tree, basically the plant kills a barrier in between the plant that's the part of the plant that's going to stick around and the part that's going to fall off. But it turned out that's not one of the big roles of abscisic acid. This is one. This is so it's related, I guess. One of the effects of abscisic acid is to promote cell death. So I guess if you think about the energy budget of a plant, sometimes it's important to sacrifice certain tissues so other ones can thrive. So if you've got, say, drought conditions, there are trees that lose their leaves as a response to drought, and they basically lose the leaves because they're a liability for water, and they drop those off, but they maintain living cells inside of the stem of the plant. And so the hormone that says, okay, you guys are done. You're no longer part of the team. We need you to take 5. So abscisic acid can make that happen. So wilting actually promoted by abscisic acid. And a little bit of back and forth between these two enzymes, gibberellic acid and abscisic acid. Just like we saw with the auxin and the cytokinin, they're kind of at different ends of the plant, producing contrary signals. And sometimes in seeds, there's this contrary signal of gibberellic acid to germinate seeds, and abscisic acid can be a signal that actually encourages seeds not to germinate. So seeds, as we saw before, it's important for them to germinate at proper times. And so sort of environmental signals might be feeding into whether these other signals are produced by the plant to encourage germination or encourage seeds to remain dormant. And then, of course, you could apply these to your seeds and maybe achieve a result. And I think this might be our last one. Ethylene was mentioned before. One of the students offered that this is the enzyme responsible for ripening your bananas. And did I say enzyme? I'm sorry, hormone. Hormone responsible for ripening bananas and often other kinds of ripening. So unlike a lot of other hormones, this one is actually a gas. So kind of interesting that a plant, produces. You can have gas trapped to a certain extent in the tissues of a plant, but then also the signal can happen by leaving the plant and sort of diffusing into the air around the plant. And that's the logic behind if you have bananas and you want to ripen your bananas faster, you can stick a ripe banana in with unripe bananas, and it will hasten the ripening of the unripe bananas because the signal, the ethylene produced during ripening, actually encourages the ripening of nearby bananas. And that's what the bag is for. So the bag is a little bit gas permeable, but allows the ethylene to build up in there and signal to the other bananas to ripen. I haven't actually tried this myself. Has anybody tried this with their bananas? I've heard you can sub in other fruits as well. So fruits that have ethylene signaling as part of their ripening, they can also convince each other to ripen. So put a tomato in with your bananas and see how that goes. It'll be kind of a fun lab. I wonder how many bananas I could get for us. So I put this slide together. This kind of highlights how hormone signaling can be important for propagating a lot of different changes that are all sort of to the same end. So fruit ripening is not just one thing. It's a lot of different processes all happening together. So as you go in this tomato example from a green tomato to a ripe red tomato, we're familiar with the color change, but along with the color change, right, there's a reason you don't typically want to eat a green tomato. It doesn't taste great. What does that mean? So a not great tasting tomato has energy stored up in starch, a little bit more than the ripe tomato has energy stored up in sugar. We've got the drop in chlorophyll, the increase in red pigment. So as an advertisement, maybe a sunscreen perhaps. Production of flavor compounds, smell compounds, maybe breakdown of toxins. So sometimes if you eat an unripe fruit, it's actually toxic. So the hormones allow a plant to kind of unify all these responses under one scenario, so one situation. Say, all right, it is time to ripen. We're going to do all these different things, all to the end, or to the goal of getting the fruit dispersed. Okay, so back to abscission, as I mentioned. So this is the process that causes leaves to fall off of the plant. There is a hormone signal that allows that to happen. What's being shown in this illustration is really the individual cells and what they're doing to let this leaf go. So on the left is the stem of the plant that's going to be retained, and on the right, this is something that would fall off. And what the plant has done is it's killing these cells. They get a signal in this location that they're going to die. And that causes a weakness, of course. Dead cells are not hollow and fragile, and so they can break at that point. It's also, the red in here is an abundance of waxes that are put in there. So the plant is basically preparing to give itself an open wound, if you think about it, right? This is a very juicy inside part of the plant. That leaf is going to fall off, and it's got all the ground tissue and the vascular tissue there. That's been a very happy internal part of the plant for a while, but that big connection to the leaf is all going to get severed. So in advance of having this wound, the plant basically closes it up ahead of time. So it's closing it up with wax, which is protective against the outside, protective against herbivores, protective against water loss. And so when it's time for leaves to fall, I quite enjoy when you get that right time of the year. You come at fall and you can just kind of boop, pop a leaf off, right? Because the plant is ready to let it go. That's the reason if you take lots of leaves of the same species, they're all going to be broken at the same place. So it's not just that the leaf dies. There are plenty of plant examples where something dies and stays there. So the leaves that fall off the plant are actually dead and also severed from the host plant. So pretty contrived situation. This is an image down here. This is a tomato fruit stalk. So if you pick your tomatoes, this is another one that's kind of enjoyable. If you get your tomatoes at just the right ripeness, when you pull them off, they just, poof, they go right apart. And that's the plant saying, all right, well, that thing is done. I'm done putting nutrients into it. It's ready to go off on its own and be grabbed by an animal. And I'm going to make that easier on me, right? The alternative is that if you didn't do this clean break, then an animal would come by and tear something, maybe tear something that you didn't want to be torn, and trying to get that fruit away. So in making it easy for the fruit to leave, that's safer on the host plant, the parent plant. All right, so here's another back and forth. Ethylene promoting abscission, auxin delaying abscission. So depending on what the plant's got going on at any one time, this might cause the leaves to fall off or stick around. One of our last topics we're going to talk about, I guess Tuesday of next week, we're going to talk about cultivation. And so we'll talk about this actually in the context of that. Some of the plants that we've cultivated are in the grass family, and they have this process where natural grasses, of course, get rid of their fruits. So they drop seeds, and those seeds can go on and start new plants. The plants that we've cultivated, they hold on to their seeds, because when we harvest something like corn or wheat or something, we'd rather not have to pick it up off the ground. So instead, we have these modified, cultivated versions, domesticated versions of wheat and other grains that have their grains intact. And this is just, I found this kind of interesting. It can be rather complex as a plant sort of deciding where to cut if you're going to drop something off. So this is a variety of different strategies in the grass family. As far as on this illustration here, these red dashed areas are where the abscission happens. So in tons of different grass species in the world, some of them drop individual seeds. Sometimes they drop an individual seed with its associated leaves, kind of like this one here, and all different strategies. So if you ever wanted to get into plant molecular biology, it's a wonderful world out there, way more than I understand. Another one that kind of highlights the importance of getting this right for a plant, timing in some plants. So like right time of year for the leaf abscission to happen. It's important to kind of time this with the environment as well. So getting the signals right and saying, okay, this species, it's important to drop the leaves here or later. There are considerations of freezing is not great for leaves. Drought conditions, if you're in an environment that usually experiences drought, it's important to maybe lose your leaves before that comes on. What this basically shows is the different species. Some of these are really narrow period of time when they just like all the leaves fall all at once. Other ones a little more gradual, just the percent of the leaves that have dropped over time. But they're kind of different times of year. Kind of compare this one a little bit earlier in the year to this one later in the year, dropping their leaves off whenever it's a good time for them. I guess it's not something you can see outside right now, but next year I'll encourage you to take a look at your pine trees if you've never noticed that. We call these evergreens, right? But they actually have a period of the year when they're dropping basically a year's worth of needles. So the reason they're evergreen is that a given leaf lasts for more than 1 year. And so there's overlap in the green leaves that are present on the plant. But there is a time when the leaves of a certain age all fall off, and a time also when the new leaves are formed in the next year. It's kind of a neat, I don't know. Before I knew about that, or when I started knowing about that, it was kind of cool to see, like, oh yeah, these are pine trees losing their leaves at this time of year, even though they're not losing all of their leaves. And if you ever wanted to, I don't know, get your plant something special for the holidays, took a long time to Photoshop this a few years ago, and I just they still advertise colognes. Abscission. All right. Okay, so that is the hormones topic. If you have questions, put those in the chat box. Let me see what our grade updates are. I have so the exams are finally graded, and there's a lab exercise up for this week. So this week's lab exercise has you grabbing images. So people who attended lab in person, we had, we're trying to grow these water ferns, azolla, in a few different nutrient conditions. And some of those, the high nutrient conditions killed them straight away, but we could investigate how much they grew maybe before they died. So I got basically the starting point for different ones of these, and then we can compare that to how well they turn out at the end. And the goal is to take the images that I have and to trim them down so that only the water fern is there. So I've done some of these you can look at. I've got a video that guides you through the process. So if everybody can do that this week, I'll have the data. I can analyze the data and see if we see anything, and we'll revisit that sometime next week. That's the lab for this week. So any grade or lab questions? Okay. So this topic today, the one that's scheduled for today, I never really know what to call it. It's basically like kind of tying together a lot of what we've seen already. So herbivory, signaling, growth strategies, all kinds of stuff. So I just kind of wanted to make this topic, it's called right now, plants in the environment. So how a given plant might like sort of optimize to its own environment wherever it finds itself. So some of the big topics today, some of these we touched on in the context of hormones, other ones we haven't really talked about much. But basically, if you're a plant, we've talked about secondary compounds as a way to sort of interact with the world, to draw pollinators in, to poison your herbivores, and so on. But there are other sort of fine tuning that plants can do to take advantage of their local environment. So they're not able to move around. If they're going to succeed, they've got to make the best of where they are. And sometimes that amounts to finding the best source of light in the local area, finding the best sources of water and nutrients, and so on. So we'll see these as the main themes: light, water, gravity, and touch, things that plants are responding to. And the fancy terms are also on here, and they're based on this Greek root of tropism. So phototropism, growing towards the light; gravitropism, hydrotropism, relating to water; thigmotropism, always like that one, thigmotropism, relating to touch. So plants being able to grow towards resources in their environment. It's a big one. So we saw previously, we talked about auxin and growing towards light. So there's not too much more to talk about with that one. This is just another recap of that experiment, kind of foundational experiments that showed that the oat coleoptile, it's a distinctive part of the seedling of an oat plant, coleoptile. That's like the first thing that comes out of the ground. But it became the thing to experiment on for this auxin light response. So grow your seedlings near the light. If the light is strong and considerably off to the side, they will bend over toward that. And as we saw last time, the bending happens because one side of this plant is growing more, the cells are expanding more on that side of the plant, the dark side of the plant, relative to the lighter side of the plant. So there's even more to it. It's not just the auxin, but it's the enzymes that respond to the presence of auxin. So this is a gene and a protein called phototropin-1. We don't really cover this stuff in much detail in this class, but if you're interested, this is something that if you're leaning a little bit more towards molecular biology, this is a way that you could study exactly what's going on. So there's obviously the light signal, there's the hormone that's involved in the response, there are the molecules that move the hormone around, there are the enzymes that respond to the presence of the hormone. And so shown right here, I think this is pretty nicely illustrated. This mutant, which is this FOT1 mutant, has a mutated version of the phototropin-1 gene, and it's unable to respond to having severe light off to one side. So kind of good evidence that this enzyme is one of the more important ones for responding to that light, one direction light source. Another way to look at that, this is transport of auxin. So I mentioned these before, these PIN proteins, these are auxin transporters. And if you have light coming from one side of the plant, getting the auxin to where it needs to be to respond to that, that's the job of these transport molecules. So they pull auxin out of some cells and pump it in towards other cells. And depending on where the light's coming from, that's what these white arrows are. Depending on where the light's coming from, the auxin is decreased on that side of the plant. So here we have auxin low on the light side of the plant after 4 hours, after 12 hours, pretty low over there. These two images show light coming equally from both sides, and the auxin is equally low on both sides of the plant there. So a different way to look at that, sort of from an enzyme molecular point of view, as far as where the auxin is getting moved to. Another response related to light. So we kind of considered before that too much light could be a problem, right? What happens if you get too much light? It dies. Yeah, it depends on your plant. We saw, let's see, let me jump ahead here. This idea, we talked about it with pigments. So some of these anthocyanins, the blue and purple pigments, they are able to protect against oxidative stress. So a little bit like sunburn. So the light shines down and interacts with the molecules inside of the cells. And sometimes some dangerous reactive oxidative molecules are formed. And these antioxidant pigments can protect against that. So these are two kinds of mosses grown in high light and low light. So sometimes there's a nice correlation of plants that are definitely getting too much light, making themselves more pigmented as a response. So this is one response. This was another one that I find interesting. So one of the reasons that those reactive oxygen species exist, the oxidative stress of getting sunlight, it's actually related to the process of photosynthesis. So if you're getting too much light on your photosynthetic machinery, that causes oxidative stress. So one response that plants can do is to actually move their chloroplasts out of the way when the sunlight is too bright. So they're sort of hiding, almost like hiding in the shade of their own cell walls. So hiding away from the more direct sunlight. So this is high light on the left and low light on the right. Actually moving those chloroplasts around. And moving chloroplasts around, I feel like that's gotten a lot more attention recently. I think we're getting better imaging, or people are looking at something they didn't think to look at before. Actually, quite a bit of moving happens with the chloroplast. So they can move around inside of a cell to go, again, towards the wall, toward the center. Is the red highlight on this one? On this image, yeah, the red one is in highlight. So if you're a moss and you find yourself in too much light, this is one way to account for, or sort of to counteract the negative effects of being in too much sunlight. So, I think we often think about mosses being in shady places. This moss might sort of prefer to grow in a shady place, but as a plant, what's the adage? Bloom where you're planted. So a given plant, if the spore lands somewhere, that plant has the option to survive or to die. And if it can make it work in that environment, then it stands a chance of reproducing. So really lots of ways that plants can optimize environments that might not be favorable. And this is one way. So another way to respond, this is the presence of gravity. So plants growing upwards, in the upper right here, this is a shoot that's responding to, the researchers took this plant and put it on its side. So what are you going to do? And this plant responded by growing, shifting and growing upwards. So maybe you've seen like trees that fall and kind of respond by coming back upwards again. Growing upwards is sometimes a combination. We've seen it in the seedlings of growing basically toward the light, but there's also growing away from gravity, right? So if you are a tall tree, highly scientific tree there. So a tree might be growing towards the sun if that sun is off to the side, but growing off to the side, especially if you're a tall, woody plant, introduces a lot of physical stress. So a lot of times maybe in the tree's interest, regardless of where the sun's coming from, to stay upright is much more stable, stable configuration to avoid falling over. So knowing where the light is part of this, but also knowing where gravity is going to be important for getting this plant growing upright. One of the ways the plants can tell where gravity is a pretty clever strategy. They have heavier starch grains inside of their cells. And this is something we see in roots. And what these two different blue images show are different orientations of the roots. So they're growing more up and down or side to side. And in both of these situations, these heavy dark blue, I think they're filled with starch. So they're just starch grains in there. They're heavier than the rest of the cell, and they fall to one side. And the place that they've fallen to tells the plant where bottom is. And for this, I like to call up something I heard once about if you get trapped in an avalanche. Anybody ever been trapped in an avalanche? Let's hope not. Apparently, it's never happened to me, but if you get buried under snow in an avalanche, it can be hard to know which way is up. So if you are trapped under the ice and you don't know which way is up, they say you should spit or watch where some water falls. If you can follow the water dropping, that'll tell you where down is. So I'm told it's hard to know up when you're under the snow, probably the same if you're underground. So if you're a plant root, you can't tell where up and down are. You kind of make your own up and down inside of the cell with these heavier starch grains. And then you can figure out which way is down, and then root will grow down. The response is also involving auxin, this hormone that we keep seeing with determining growth direction. And auxin in roots has a little bit different effect. So this relates to the auxin-cytokinin split. Cytokinin is more of a growth encourager for roots, and auxin is now, as this says over here, an inhibitor of growth. So the auxin is pumped in a root, if it's growing sideways, pumped into the lower part of that, slows down the growth and division of these cells, and the cells higher up then can take over and kind of push the root downwards. A couple examples here of a few different mutants being able to sense up and down, or then a couple of these, this one, and so I and K here, mutated in a way that makes it hard for them to know which way is up. So getting at again, the genes responsible for sensing the auxin signal in the first place. So how do you know how plants respond to gravity? Well, one thing you might want to research is how plants respond in no gravity. I think as much as anything, sometimes they just want a reason to fund something into space. But, you see maybe some headlines about this. If people are going to go on long space missions, they need food. And if you have plants with you, you might be able to grow some food using simpler starting ingredients. So you got your water, your air, and light, you can grow yourself a plant that you can eat. Say you're 3 years out on your way to Mars, grow yourself some vegetables. Also, treat the breathable air, give yourself a better oxygen boost if you got plants on board. So it is kind of a serious interest to know, okay, well, what does it take to grow a plant in space? If you put a plant in space and it, completely forgot how to make a shoot or a leaf or something, that would be a problem. So it's good to make sure that plants kind of have it together, have the wherewithal to make what they need, even if they're not in gravity. A few videos today.
Essentially, it's a weed. Plant biologists Annalisa Paul and Robert Furl at the University of Florida Gainesville Space Plants Lab grow the humble weed Arabidopsis on purpose to find clues about how plants behave in extreme conditions, such as
how do plants grow differently on orbit or on the moon or on Mars?
Spaceflight in particular is something that no organism on the face of the Earth has experienced ever in its evolutionary history. So how do you deal with that? We're really intrigued by what metabolic tools a plant will dip into to deal with something that it has no experience with.
Dr. Paul and Dr. Furl use glow-in-the-dark markers that show which genes are turned on when the plants are stressed. Then they strap Arabidopsis in for some unique situations, like parabolic flight, which mimics the weightlessness of space.
Parabolic flight is a very interesting and exciting thing for plants and plant biologists. Plants know when they're in a jet airplane. Now, they don't know that in their brains because they don't have them, but it's recorded in their metabolism.
Plants are just exquisitely sensitive to changes in their environment. They can't go anywhere. And so they become the masters of their metabolic universe. They can respond even in the first 30 seconds of a parabolic set.
The parabolic flights also help the researchers figure out which experiments would work, or not, for astronauts in zero-G. Then it's blast-off time. Arabidopsis seeds were placed in cassettes with nutrient gel and launched to the International Space Station. Once on board, they're placed in a growth chamber, with some cassettes receiving more light than others. Astronauts monitor the 12-day experiments before returning the aged Arabidopsis back to Earth, where Dr. Paul and Dr. Furl were waiting to analyze their growth.
On Earth, we usually grow them vertically. And so we grow them on a vertical surface, and then the roots will grow pretty much straight down the surface of the plates. When you grow them in space, you think about it, there's no gravity to tell the roots which way to grow.
One idea would be that in the absence of gravity, the plant roots would simply wander around aimlessly. Another expectation might be that if light was a strong enough cue, they would simply grow in a single direction away from the light.
At first, the space plants grew down the plate like they would on Earth, but then the Arabidopsis that were grown further from the light did something different.
At about the 5-day mark, they started to do this characteristic, what we call skewing, this kind of jog to the left.
Since the times of Darwin in the 1800s, it's been understood that this angled growth of roots, the skewing, was due to gravity.
Instead of gravity guiding its growth, Arabidopsis used light. A closer look at the proteins involved in plant behavior revealed that 480 genes underwent significant changes during spaceflight. Next, Dr. Paul and Dr. Furl will delve deeper into these changes, even growing plants in the dark. Their testing could help us become better farmers in extreme conditions on Earth and in suborbital vehicles, paving the way for taking plants to the moon and Mars.
Plants have a very key role in keeping humans alive in long-term spaceflight. It's simply impractical. It's very difficult. It costs too much jet fuel, too much rocket fuel, too much nuclear fuel to boost all of our food to the surface of Mars and have it be there for enough years to keep a human colony alive.
Who knows, this lowly pioneering plant could one day become an intrepid Mars explorer.
So gravity, very important. Growing downwards for roots, growing upwards for stems, that seems pretty reasonable. However, sometimes growing down isn't the best way to get water. So the roots are interested in growing down. For water is usually more abundant lower down. Might be good for plant stability to grow deeper into the soil. But if, under experimental conditions where the researchers basically make sure that the water is closer to the surface and not farther down, then you see an example like this where this root has grown down, basically detected that there's not, it's like diminishing returns, there's not water down, lower down, so it stops growing down and grows off to the side. Here's another experiment showing a seedling that has the ability to grow down, but it's next to a water source that it can kind of follow the water gradient toward that. So this is, some of the hormones potentially involved, the genes potentially involved, but obviously plants pretty able to find water. Also connected with the ability to make lateral roots. So this is an experiment where they grew a root down the side of agar. So it basically was a root growing in one direction, and on one side it had moist conditions that it could grow towards. The other side, it was just the bare air, so wet and dry. And they see much more toward the wet side, plants investing in side roots that are going to grow that way. So they're basically preparing to make some lateral roots over here. So the endodermis, that barrier, is breaking down to make room for this lateral root to come out. A few different images of that. So sensing underground, potentially underground directions to grow that are going to be more rewarding or less rewarding to get water from. Not too much different here. I kind of hesitated to have this one in here with just another root growing in a different direction in response to a water gradient. This was a study from a little while back, kind of interesting. The plants, they did this plant root choice experiment where they grow a seedling in two-sided pipe system where the seedling can grow down and then basically choose left or right depending on what's at the ends of those. And they found that they would actually grow towards not just the presence of water, but the sound of running water. So plants are able to sense the vibrations associated with water and change their direction of growth in that response. Maybe a little bit related to that, sensing touch is also important to plants. Particularly important if you've got a plant that has a twining or viney habit. So plants that twine around stuff, that is not just their normal way of growing, but they can respond to sensing that they've found something and wrapping up it. And as I show you with these hair illustrations over here, the hairs can be an important part of sensing that, right? So just like on your skin, you can feel touch maybe a little more sensitively if you've got some hair there to sense the contact. Plants have hair on the outside, and that contact of running into something, if you're a plant that needs to twine up something, then knowing that you've run into something is an important signal to getting that to happen. And I've got a few videos of plants growing, and you can see them maybe a little bit kind of responding to the conditions in their environment.
The light is more than 60 feet above them. Luckily, other plants, trees, have already made the trip, and the vines can hitch a ride. They won't get very high unless they can hold on tight. Like fingertips searching for a hold, this ivy's adhesive pads grip the bark. Some creepers use sharp claws to grapple onto the steep tree face. A cat's claw creeper hooks its tendrils into the tiniest crevices and hauls itself to the top. With every foot the plant climbs, the light grows stronger, and with more fuel in its tank, the creeper can edge still higher. This passion flower tendril seems to flail aimlessly in midair, but in fact, it's searching for a toehold. Once it finds a place to anchor itself, its tendril coils around and around, gradually pulling the plant up, reeling it in. All these travelers make it into the light in a matter of days. Plant paradise. And with energy abundant, the passion flowers flower.
Oops. So these show not just sensing the contact, but some plants, as I'll show you in the next couple of videos, if they're looking for something to climb up, they sort of explore the space around them. So they do this, this, I guess, behavior, you call it, this movement called nutation, where they kind of wrap around in their space, and they use that to explore. Maybe there's something in the vicinity that's a good thing to climb up. So a little bit changes gears a little bit when it detects that it's on this string that it's climbing up towards. So it did that, weapon around, and then as it recognizes that it has a contact with a surface, it grows in a way that sort of keeps sending it toward that surface in a three-dimensional direction. What happens if they don't find anything to grow on? Good question. I guess you know, like a cucumber plant or something, a squash you might have in your garden, those are plants that are equipped to grow up surfaces, and we often just let them scramble along the ground. So I think, you know, there's quite a variety of vines out there, but I think if they were in a local area and they'd grown up looking for something, if they didn't find something to grab onto, at some point they can't support that weight, and they might, the heavier, older parts of the plant would probably come down to the ground. But also, you know, crawling along the ground is a good way to explore the area too. So another plant that comes to mind, we have wild grapes, and our wild grapes, a lot of times you find them in like an open field, and they're just there. It's not really their ideal. I feel like I never see them flower or fruit in those locations, but they still have a toehold. And if something comes along to grow up in, say, several years down the road, they would be able to grow up that plant. So they're maybe kind of biding their time until something is there to grow up, or maybe growing, you know, sort of scrambling along the ground instead. You know, if there's nothing there, there's nothing there, and they're going to make do with what they can. I'd have to look into it. The grapevines, always, I find them interesting because they're pretty abundant if they're in like a prairie habitat. But where I see them flowering is where they're able to grow up some shrubs off to the side of the prairie or a different area. So they're perennial plants. They would stick around in that area. And then if the conditions change, that one plant grapevine that's still in place, if it's there and then another plant comes along that it can grow up, then it's already set to make that happen. So they've got a decent fallback strategy, I guess, what I want to say. All right, I guess we'll watch it climb up a little bit more. I got one more of these after this too. This is also a good reference point if you wanted a visual for how plants grow. If we talked about way back at the beginning of the semester, plants, the older parts of plants are basically fixed in place. So as they grow up, it's not like the whole plant is coming with it. They leave the older leaves behind, and then newer growth heads upwards. So kind of important, I guess, to think about the whole plant in one of these videos. So a little bit of a difference here. This plant has tendrils. It's able to keep the stem basically in place and do the work of finding with these tendrils that grow off to the side. So I mentioned the plants finding water through vibrations. Vibration, sensing touch, actual contact is one form of sensing vibration or sensing contact. Sensing vibration is another kind of variation on that. It turns out that plants can detect if they're being chewed on just by the sound of it. So they like these experiments where they sort of isolate the sound. I don't know what the sound of a caterpillar chewing is, but they had this PBL playback leaf. So they put the sound over here and then watched it response in this study leaf over here, systemic leaf. And by playing the sound of chewing over here, they would get a response on this leaf. Measured down here is the aliphatic glucosinolates, so a defensive chemical producing a response. So this plant, a little bit of is being chewed on, and other parts of that plant respond by pumping out more defensive chemicals. Another form of touch response is found in a lot of these are carnivorous plants. So Venus flytrap, sundews respond to knowing that they're contacting a food item, and they close up in a variety of ways. So closing up the Venus flytrap or rolling up the sundew leaf. This one is this is a Venus flytrap. This one is it's called a sensitive plant. It's not a carnivorous plant, but it does have a really interesting rapid response to being touched.
The Venus Flytrap. Like the sundew, it makes itself very beautiful, at least to a bug, oozing fragrant nectar across the surface of each leaf. The eating's good here, but any visiting insect had better watch out for these 6 tiny hairs. This fly doesn't know the game is rigged. If it strikes one of these hair triggers, it can carry on feeding. But that contact activates a 20-second timer. A second contact while the timer's running, and an electrical impulse is triggered, and the leaf snaps shut in a fraction of a second. The tips lock together like prison bars. If the fly is very big or very small, it may just beat the rap. But most get the death penalty. 10 days later, the trap reopens. All that remains is a desiccated husk. The plant has finished its meal and once again sets the table for the next victim.
So I probably should have had that other one about being chewed on related to this topic. So this is one of the signals. This is another hormone we didn't talk about in detail before. Jasmonic acid is often used as a signal for defense. And what's shown here, the abundance, the increase in the jasmonic acid response after being damaged. So a plant that's not damaged has a relatively low amount of this. And then a plant in response to being damaged, either at the early seedling stage or older stage, all these blue parts are increasing their defensive response. So they're signaling damage and responding to that by producing more defensive compounds. And this is relatively recent video. The next ones show just how quickly this response can come about. This is a not terribly sped up video. There's a caterpillar chewing in the lower left, and every place where it's lighting up, this is the response of the plant signaling like, oh crap, we might be the next thing to get chewed on. Here's another one. So a little damage off to the side, and then boom. And one more time. Whoosh. So the response there, this Jasmonic acid response, is what we call an induced response. So there are a couple of ways to live as a plant. You can always defend yourself, or you could defend yourself in response to being attacked. And there's, as the slide here suggests, a potential trade-off there. It costs energy to make that defense, right? So if you're putting in defensive chemicals, then that's a nutrient and energy draw, and that energy could have been used for something else. And so this is actually just a response of plants that have been touched. So maybe you've experienced this with your own plants. Sometimes touching plants causes them to do more poorly. So you can talk to your plants, but apparently hard music they don't like. So they're being beaten up a little bit, then that causes them to defend themselves, and it's really at the expense of more growth. So two situations of plants of the same age, and the ones that were touched more often spent their energy on defense and didn't have enough energy or as much energy to grow and produce leaves. So induced is making something in response, and constitutive would be a term referring to defense that's always on. So there's a trade-off. There's also, potential advantage to the constitutive method, right? Can you think of an advantage to having your defenses on all the time? So a little bit harder to get surprised if you're less likely to be injured. Yeah, I think you're probably getting at what I was thinking about. So, there's that video where the caterpillar is here. That caterpillar is able to show up and start chewing at some point. So this plant is responding with defense, but maybe at the cost of a few early losses. So different plants will have different strategies. That's one of our big themes for the class. So some plants are always poisonous, toxic. Some plants are more toxic in response to being chewed on. And either of those work. So study here, resistance versus tolerance also. So potentially the energy, looking at this from an energy standpoint, so being defended against something that's trying to eat you is energetically expensive. Maybe another way to do that is just to put up with it and kind of grow back in response. And there are different plants that do both of those strategies. Some of the more interesting, we talked about, let's see, what was the context we talked about this? And I think we talked about it in volatile scent compounds as signaling for a plant to defend itself or be defended by sometimes animals that eat the herbivores that are on there. This was a study that talked about two species that grow in a similar area. So sage here and the coyote tobacco. And by damaging one plant, they found that this would actually cause neighboring plants of a different species to respond by defending themselves. So I think we talked a lot about plants having more unique approaches chemically, so having their own scents and their own signaling molecules. This is a place where it's an advantage to have two different species using the same signal. So this jasmonate signal is a commonly used plant signal for damage. This tobacco plant senses that a neighbor is being chewed on, and that might be enough for it to put up some defense. And then here's another one similar to what we saw before, this passing on the signal of a plant that's being attacked. And this signal, in this example, they investigated what happens if we control for other factors and just let these plants be connected using their mycorrhizal fungi. And turns out that was an effective way, these hyphal connections intact were an effective way for drawing in the parasitoid of the aphids that were chewing on the plants. So I think there's probably a lot of research yet to be done on this. Lots of interesting ways that plants communicate with each other. Locked in my country. Well, that's a problem. Well, darn. I gotta check my links more. Let's see if I can. Ah, take that. I saved a copy. 9:30.
They don't have eyes or ears to meet Consuelo de Moraes and Mark Mesher, the scientists who solved that mystery.
So there's a patch here of our species that grows locally.
We brought this plant to the lab, this parasitic plant, Cascuda daughter. We're looking at how these plants interact, but how do they find the host? And we thought for sure somebody had already done that. And then we went.
I'm going to try to find a better version of this. Hold on, video. Exercise video.
Or some plants of their vine may be good at finding a victim. Could it actually choose between two different host plants? De Moraes and Mesher made it their mission to find out. In a series of experiments, they placed wheat and tomato seedlings in the same pot and planted a newly sprouted daughter vine between them. Then they set up a time.
Sorry, I might have skipped ahead a little bit of the explanation here. This is a plant that is also a parasite called daughter, and so it needs to, after the seed germinates, it needs to find a host plant. And so what they were experimenting on, like finding out how this parasite finds a plant to parasitize in its environment.
Lapse camera to see if the seedling was actually making a choice. For hours, it circles the air like a snake, as if sniffing out its victims. And 9 times out of 10, its preferred victim is the juicy tomato, a tender plant that's easier to attach to.
You really get this sense of a behavior response. So really, there's some fairly strong selection here for this plant to make the right decision. Otherwise, it will die.
But how was the little stem making its choice? The team decided to play a hunch. They knew that all plants produce green leaf volatiles, chemical scents released by their leaves as they breathe. So maybe this predatory plant actually was sniffing out its victim. To test that theory, the team devised another experiment. First, they captured the scent of a tomato, essentially condensing the chemical odor released by the plant. Once it's distilled, they present the tomato perfume to the vine, along with a real tomato it can't possibly smell. Time after time, the daughter hones in on the chemical language that says, yes, I'm a tomato.
There's no doubt with the daughter, there's choice. There's choice involving a suitable host or non-suitable host. This is a very familiar thing in animal foraging behavior that we're seeing in this plant foraging behavior.
But the daughter isn't the only plant that's exhibiting animal-like behavior. Once it's under full-scale daughter attack, the tomato releases the chemical equivalent of a scream. In fact, many plants emit a chemical SOS when they're under attack, and we've all caught a whiff of it. It's the smell of freshly cut grass.
We all love the smell of freshly cut grass. We all love the smell of flowers that we put into a vase. We all love the smells of plants. But those smells mean one thing to us than they mean to the other individuals in that environment. And we are causing stress. We are causing trauma to these plants. It's the plant's way of calling out for help.
So if it's a cry for help, who or what are plants calling out to? Well, if this unassuming desert...
I think we'll probably run out of time before we finish that one. I don't know, I can play it for you some other time if you want. Just another example here of a plant that's being chewed on by a herbivore, lets out these volatile compounds, and they basically are animals that respond to that and then come and eat the things that are eating the plant. So we've seen a few examples of that. So I think that's probably a good place to stop anyway. Questions for today? Olfactory receptors. I don't know the details of where it would be sensed. Olfactory, the scent sensing basically comes down to a receptor molecule on a cell interacting with the smell molecule. And so we have organs that are modified to be enriched for that. We've got taste and smell, and that's associated in our bodies with where we pass the air over. So as we breathe, we're passing air over the nose and mouth. I don't know if plants have. It's a great question. If they have a part of their body that's more enriched for receptors. I don't even know if it's a surface receptor or internal or... Good question. Somebody should do their project on that. But as far as I know, they don't have a specific, anything that's specific as a organ or modification, like a modification you could see as a structure that's for detecting scent chemicals. But I don't know either, so time to find out. That's one of the things I didn't do for announcements. If I did get your research papers, I'll try to get some comments back for that. The ones I've looked at so far look pretty good. So one thing you're probably working on already, your presentations for those for next week. Let me know if anything's comes up that you want feedback on. Otherwise, I look forward to what you come up with. Any more questions? All right, time to research plant smelling.